Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Bryant. Welcome to another program in the Merowith Center's continuing series, Fighting Bigotry and Hatred. Today, we are featuring Dr. Dorothy Canter, president of the Rosenwald Park Campaign. She has graciously agreed to join us and share insights into how the Rosenwald Fund, which was established by Sears, Roebuck Company President Julius Rosenwald, underwrote the research that the Supreme Court used to help overturn the long-standing separate but equal principle. This not only changed the Warren Court's 1954 ruling, but also changed the discussion of integration and civil rights for the next 70 years. She'll also explain how to sign a petition to protect and preserve the legacy of Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald School. So stay tuned to the very end. This program is co-sponsored by ADL Heartland, American Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis, National Council of Jewish Women St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum, and the campaign to create the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools of National Historic Parks. Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you. Greetings. I thank Laura and the Merowith Center and the other co-sponsors of this program for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today about the Julius Rosenwald Fund, in particular, its role in the Brown versus Board of Education case. Several months ago, fellow campaign board member and editor of our newsletter, Stephanie Deutsch, gave a talk to this group about Julius Rosenwald, which focused on his relationship with Booker T. Washington and the Rosenwald schools. And I have a problem. This is not moving forward. Okay. To begin, I'm going to just give you a little background on the campaign, and then I'm going to talk very briefly about Rosenwald and the Rosenwald schools. For those of you who were not present for Stephanie's very enlightening talk. The Rosenwald Park Campaign was created in 2016. Its mission is to create the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park. It'll be a multi-site unit in multiple states. It will consist of a visitor center, a brand new state-of-the-art visitor center in Chicago to interpret and show the overall legacy and life of Julius Rosenwald, and a small number of Rosenwald schools in the South. All of this will be selected by the National Park Service, we hope, in the not too distant future. So let me talk a little bit about Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington and the schools, and then we'll get into the main part of the program. Julius Rosenwald was born in 1862 in Springfield, Illinois. He was the son of German Jewish immigrants who were in the clothing business. They had a clothing store in Springfield. His boyhood home was directly across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. However, he never saw the president because the president had left to become the president before he was born, and we know how he came back to Springfield. He left high school early, Julius did, and to go to New York to learn the clothing trade from his uncles. He ended up in Chicago manufacturing men's suits, and by a lucky break, he got the opportunity to invest in a new startup company, a catalog company by the name of Sears Roebuck. And he got the opportunity because Alva Roebuck, the partner of Sears, and Sears, Richard Sears, was a merchandising genius, but he didn't know how to run the business. And Alva Roebuck started out as a watchmaker, watch repairer, and he decided to leave the business. And so Julius Rosenwald got this opportunity along with his brother-in-law. And before you knew it, he became rich, very, very rich, richer than he would have ever imagined. And being brought up in the Jewish tradition, he believed in tzedakah, which is a Hebrew word that means literally social justice, doing right for other people. It's not just charity, it's helping to make the world better. And so he had some initial activities in funding for African-American programs, and he met Booker T. Washington. They bonded. Washington invited him to be on the board of Tuskegee. And then when Julius Rosenwald turned 50, he had a big party. Didn't have a big party. He gave money away, and some of it went to Tuskegee, and Washington suggested a school building program. It started with 6 schools in and around Tuskegee. Remember, the African-American families there were paying taxes, but they were getting little to no education. And whatever education they got was strictly segregated. From this modest beginning in 1912, by 1932, when the building program ended, there were 5,357 school facilities. It was almost 5,000 schools plus teacher homes, plus shop buildings. I always like to use this slide because I believe that, photos and maps can replace 1,000 words. And these schools were in 15 states, from Maryland to Florida, from North Carolina to Oklahoma, and from Louisiana to Missouri. Yes, there were a few schools in Missouri. And they educated over 600,000 African-American children, and 1/3 of the African-Americans in the South went to Rosenwald schools, and they made a really big difference. This is the top photo is of a typical Rosenwald school, two-teacher Rosenwald school from 1920 until the end of the program. They had standardized building plans. And if you see a school like this, a building like this, it's either a Rosenwald school or perhaps it's also a white school that used Rosenwald school building plans. And below is a photo of a class from one of the Rosenwald schools. So that's all I'm going to say today about Rosenwald schools. That is the part of his philanthropy that is the best known and perhaps is the most impactful. But I'm going to also speak today about the Rosenwald Fund Fellowship Program, which is even less well known. But before I do that, I just want you to know that Rosenwald also gave to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It was founded on February 9, 1909, the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birthday. It was founded to some large extent because of the heinous nature of the Springfield 1908 race riot. And keep in mind, Springfield was Julius Rosenwald's boyhood home. And Julius Rosenwald gave to the NAACP early in its existence. One of the years in the teens, he was the second most highest contributor, only being surpassed by the Rockefeller Foundation. In 1925, this is going to be important, I believe. In 1925, Howard University, which was one of the top historically Black colleges and universities in the nation, if not the top, it had a law school, but its law school was in danger of losing its accreditation because its law library was not up to snuff. And Julius Rosenwald, did what he usually did. He gave challenge grants, and he gave a grant of $2,500 for the law library if it was matched by independent funds, which it was. And this staved off any possibility of the law school losing its accreditation, which we will see could have been very, very bad. And here is a photo of Howard University. And it's not only the law school, but Howard University plays an important role in this overall story for a number of reasons, which we shall see. So in 1917, Julius Rosenwald joined the board of the Rockefeller Foundation, and I believe he served on it for the rest of his life. And not long thereafter, he created his own foundation. I kind of think, I was a scientist, by the way, so unsupported by any data, but I kind of think that his being on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation helped trigger him creating his own foundation. And it was for the well-being of mankind. And for the first 10 to 11 years, it focused on the school building program. But in 1928, he brought in a president, the first president to run the foundation. His name was Edwin Embry, and he had been a vice president at the Rockefeller Foundation. By the way, Julius Rosenwald, for the little I know, was a very good selector of people to work for him, under him, with him. Good choice of character. Okay, so in 1928, one of the program developed new areas for philanthropy, and one was the fellowship program. And in the fellowship program, they gave grants mainly for 1 year, but sometimes 2 or 3 years, to highly qualified, talented people, usually in the beginning part of their career, not always. And 2/3 of these fellowships went to African Americans. Another program was their medical and health services program. I will not be speaking about that today, however, but it was also to help African Americans be more representative in the health field and train more doctors, nurses, midwives, etc. Okay, so let's get to the Rosenwald Fund Fellowship Program and Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, the case. That should say case, not cause, sorry. Okay, this was the commander-in-chief. I don't know if you can see the title at the top. That was Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall, let me start off. This Thurgood Marshall is the only person that I'm going to be talking about today who was not a Rosenwald Fund Fellow. Thurgood Marshall went to Howard University Law School because he was not accepted at the University of Maryland. In spite of his very high grades, he was not accepted because he was African American. And he graduated from Howard as a valedictorian, and he went to work for the NAACP in 1933, and he went to work for the NAACP starting in 1936. By the time Brown versus Board of Education came about, he was the head of the Legal Defense and Education Fund, which brought the cases. Okay, and let's continue. From now on, the other people that I'm going to be talking about were all Rosenwald Fellows. And I'll be telling you their role in the case and also background about them and their fellowships. So the second in command was Robert Lee Carter. He attended, like Thurgood Marshall, Howard Law School. And he used his Rosenwald Fellowship for graduate studies in law at Columbia University. And he joined the NAACP in 1944. He was deeply involved in school desegregation cases. He was interested in the psychological effects of segregation on people, particularly on African Americans. He met Kenneth and Mamie Phipps Clark. If you haven't heard of them, I'm going to tell you a lot about them in a minute. And he served he was directly under Marshall in preparing the second brief for the Supreme Court. I should have started with this, but I'll bring it in now. So the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka case was actually 4 cases for advocating for desegregation on the basis that it was unconstitutional. The most well-known, of course, is Brown versus Board of Education, but there were cases in 3 other states in the District of Columbia. So Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Delaware. And then the Supreme Court heard the case in early 1953, and made the decision that it wanted to have a rehearing, and it sent out questions for both the plaintiffs and the defendants to answer, to have a second hearing of the case, which took place near the end of 1953. Okay, so that just gives you the background, which I should have given about a minute or two ago. So getting back to Robert Lee Carter, he knew Kenneth and Mamie Phipps Clark, and he knew the work, the research they were doing and the results, and he was the one who persuaded Thurgood Marshall of the importance of their studies, the doll studies, which I'll get to. And he then coordinated all the preparations for the re-argument at the end of 1953. And he was the director of the legal research that the NAACP conducted. There were two research, the legal and the non-legal. And he drafted himself much of the legal re-argument brief. Now that's Robert Lee Carter. By the way, he ended up later as a federal judge. I think it was a district judge. So I mentioned the Clarks. This was a husband and wife couple, Kenneth and Mamie Phipps Clark. Both of them attended Howard, but not the law school. They both received PhDs. Kenneth Clark got a Rosenwald Fellowship in 1940. His wife, Mamie Phipps Clark, got one in 1940, but she got two more to enable her to finish her PhD studies at Columbia University. And the studies were the doll studies. If we were all together in person, I would ask how many of you know about the doll studies, but we can't do that. So I'm just going to go into it. But before I do, Kenneth Clark was really of great importance. In the June order from the court for a re-argument, one of the things they asked to be included was how it might be best to proceed if the court ruled that school desegregation violated the 14th Amendment. And the NAACP collected and analyzed examples of desegregation in order to suggest workable approaches. And Kenneth Clark was responsible for this, for developing the research plan. And he then called upon a group of social psychologists, of which he was one, to aid in the collection of data. And Clark organized the information, drew from it, and developed the principles for implementing desegregation and prepared the final report. So, what are the doll studies? This is a very famous photograph. It's taken by Gordon Parks. In fact, he took a whole series of photographs. And in the doll studies, young African-American children, mainly pre-kindergarten children, but some in the early levels of education, were presented with two dolls. And the dolls were identical in every way except one. One was white and one was brown. And the children were then asked a series of questions about the dolls, such as, which doll do you like the best? Which is the one you'd like to play with? Which one is a nice doll? Which one is the bad doll? And so on and so forth, as you can see here, which is most like you. And not 100%, but the majority of the children selected the white doll, said it was nicer and it was better to play with. Here's another photograph, not nearly as famous, by Gordon Parks, of the child holding the white doll, and Kenneth Clark in the background watching on. This actually, we own this photograph, bought it on eBay, and we think it's just a copy of one of the proofs of for Gordon Parks' photography. And these studies presented important evidence as to how the segregation affected African-American children, and it caused in them, I will quote, deep feelings of inferiority and a sense of personal humiliation, unquote. And it also caused confusion about their personal worth and even at times self-hatred. These studies were the bedrock of what led to the court to decide that separate but equal was unconstitutional. So these people, importantly, went on to distinguished careers, but I will leave that for some other time. Okay, so we've talked about Thurgood Marshall, the commander-in-chief, Robert Lee Carter, the Clarks, who were not lawyers, but PhDs. And now we get to the director of non-legal research. And that was John Aubrey Davis. And he received 3 Rosenwald fellowships in 1938, 39, and 40. His field was political science. And Davis had been the teacher to Robert Carter, who went to undergraduate at Lincoln University. For those of you who have not heard of Lincoln University, it is a historically Black college and university in Pennsylvania. It was the very first university that was established in this nation for African Americans. And both Carter and John Aubrey Davis used their Rosenwald fellowships to get graduate degree. And as I said, he was the head of non-legal research. And his deputy director, and often we know the deputy directors do a lot of the work for non-legal research, was Mabel Murphy Smythe, another Rosenwald fellow. She had just returned from 2 years of teaching in Japan. She was an economist, and she did much of the research and organizing of the material. Let me say now that this work was all done over the summer of 1953, and Thurgood Marshall and his team called it the 6-month summer because they worked so hard during those 3 months to pull it all together. So, in the non-legal team, there were 3 historians: Horace Mann Bond, C. Van Woodward, John Hope Franklin. So Horace Mann Bond, and he was the president at that time, he was the president of Lincoln University, and he specialized in history, and he had a key role. It was his job to address the court's question regarding the 14th Amendment. And it was to determine how congressmen and state legislators viewed the amendment's application to public schools. It's sort of to do the congressional history and state history. And he came up with a very good argument. And he contended that education was now, when the school systems began to be organized by local governments, this is during the Reconstruction era, and funded by tax revenues, and when state laws required attendance, education then became a civil right of all people in this nation. Bond contended that education was now subject to the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection of the laws. He reviewed new constitutions in former Confederate states. This is before they changed them after Reconstruction was overturned. And he called attention to the fact that none of those states segregated education, mentioned segregated education. And the omission he interpreted as evidence that Southern legislators reckoned that the 14th Amendment would prohibit all legal forms of racial discrimination, including segregated public schooling. And he contended as well that precisely because they understood that education would be subject to the equal protection of the laws, the lawmakers had no reason to address the issue in a constitutional provision. this was what he contended, and the other side contended in an opposite direction. And as I said, this played a role, but it was certainly not the defining role. Okay, so that was Horace Mann Bond. C. Van Woodward was the only white person, Rosenwald Fellow, who worked on the Brown versus Board of Education case. He did research on Reconstruction and what caused its demise. And he was Johns Hopkins historian. He was a leading authority on the post-Civil War South. He got his Rosenwald Fellowship in 1940, and he used it for postdoctoral training after he had his PhD. And he did this work in the right before the U.S. entered the Second World War at the Library of Congress. And his role was to explain the circumstances that ended Reconstruction. And he drew heavily on two books that he himself had written, published, and much of the work for those two books was enabled by his Rosenwald Fellowship. Lastly, John Hope Franklin. He was formerly a professor of history at Howard University, and he was the author of the most authoritative account of African American experience. And his job was to prepare a monograph on the emergence of legally enforced segregation in the late 19th century. He investigated the strategies and intentions of the Southerners who perpetuated and enforced segregation at that time. And he concluded that it was clear that egalitarian disposition that underlay all the Civil War amendments had been steadily, indeed deliberately, undercut after Reconstruction. And the work that Woodward and Franklin did was incorporated in the footnotes to the decision 8 times. Before I go on to some other Rosenwald fellows who were part of this case, let me tell you a little bit more about John Hope Franklin. He was a trailblazer. He was born in Tulsa. His father was affected dramatically by the Tulsa race riots. His father had been a lawyer. His office was burned down during the riots. They survived. He went on to Fisk University, and from Fisk University, he went to Harvard for his graduate degree in history, and he received, I believe, 2 Rosenwald fellowships to help him do his graduate work. His first job was at Howard University. For these people, the best and the brightest, even after they got their PhDs, did postdoctoral research in certain cases, many cases, still were not able at that time in the 30s and the 40s, most of them, to break into mainstream America. Jobs were not available at white universities, so in the government or in industry. And I say John Hope Franklin was a trailblazer. His first job was at Howard. From there, he went to Brooklyn College. Then he went to the University of Chicago, where I believe he had a department of history. And he finally ended up as the head of the department in Duke University, very much in the South. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And from my perspective as a big National Park fan, he was on he may have even been the chairman, but he was certainly on the National Parks Advisory Board. So he was a real trailblazer. And this generation and these people who received these fellowships helped open it up for the people that after them stood on their shoulders. So, those were the people who worked on the case. And before they went to go back to the Supreme Court with the final second brief, they had a group of peer reviewers. And among the peer reviewers, and the peer review took place in September 1953 in New York City at a 3-day conference. And their job was to critique the work that had been done and to give advice. And Of the 42, many of them were lawyers, but there were also some historians, psychologists, etc., in attendance. And these three were Rosenwald Fellows. The first one is Allison Davis. And Davis was the older brother of John Aubrey Davis. He was a distinguished professor, excuse me, at the University of Chicago. He had broken through. And he was an anthropologist. And he had earlier published work on school segregation in Mississippi and Alabama. The next person is Rayford Logan. And he was, guess where he was a professor? Howard University. He was a well-known historian at Howard, and he had a deep commitment to civil rights causes. And also from Howard University was Charles H. Thompson, and he was the dean of the graduate school and founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Negro Education. Not present, but equally and probably more influential was Charles S. Johnson. He had been a Rosenwald Fellow. He was associated with the Rosenwald Fund for many years. As a matter of fact, he was, after his Rosenwald Fellowship, he was one of the three people who served to select the future fellows. And he was a sociologist, and he was the first white African-American president of Fisk University, very noted person. So that brings me to the next group. These were the people who worked directly with the NAACP. Many of them were paid by the NAACP. The peer reviewers, I don't think so, but they worked directly on the case. And I'm going to talk about these two, support from these two sociologists. Remember I talked about Kenneth and Mamie Phipps Clark, but they, more so Kenneth Clark, but also Mamie Phipps Clark, testified in several of the earlier lawsuits on challenging school segregation, excuse me. And they wrote a paper entitled The Effects of Segregation and Consequences of Desegregation, a Social Science Statement. Again, this was probably in response to the request from the Supreme Court about if segregation was overthrown, how would you implement desegregation? And they recruited 30 other scholars and psychologists to sign it. Among those 30 were two Rosenwald Fellows, E. Franklin Frazier and Ira D.A. Reed. And Frazier was the first Black president of the American Sociological Association. He taught at Howard for 28 years. And Reed served on the faculty of several institutions, starting with Atlanta University, which was an HBCU. We moved to New York University, and then to Haverford, where he was the college's first Black professor and became chair of its Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And now I'm going to speak about somebody who wrote the Bible. This person, who actually did end up as the first female Episcopal priest, but Thurgood Marshall said that she wrote the Bible of Brown versus Board of Education. The lady's name is Pauli Murray. She was really a trailblazer. I personally believe that she was brilliant. I don't use that term very often. Even before there were sit-ins and Rosa Parks sat in the front of the school bus, Pauli Murray in the late 30s or early 40s sat in the front of a bus in Virginia with a friend and was arrested. She went to Howard Law School. She was the valedictorian in her class, and it was traditional that the valedictorian would go for graduate law education to Harvard, sometimes Columbia, like Robert Lee Carter, and she was refused admission to Harvard. She wasn't refused admission because she was African American. She was refused admission because she was a woman. And she was friendly with Eleanor Roosevelt, and nothing held her back. She got Eleanor to get Franklin to write to the president of Harvard. He wouldn't rescind his decision. She went on to the University of California at Berkeley and did her law master's degree there and did very important work. But apropos of Harvard, a few years later, they did change their policy and started allowing women to attend Harvard, which helped Ruth Bader Ginsburg immensely. Why is she called why is it that Thurgood Marshall said she wrote the Bible of Brown versus Board? That is because she while she was at University of California in Berkeley, she started research on segregation in the United States, and that led to her writing a book of 740 pages long that was called States, Laws on Race and Color. And it detailed the varying segregation laws in each of the country's states. And as I said, this is what Marshall called the Bible of Brown versus Board. I have no personal interest in this book, but I read the book. I liked it very much. We know who the firebrand was, and we know who the First Lady was. Pauli Murray also has an autobiography that she wrote that I'm about to get. And I just think she was a very influential person. She also was involved early on in her work for rights for women. And when Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the brief for the case Reed versus Reed that went to the Supreme Court, she added Pauli Murray's name to the brief, although Pauli Murray did not work on the case per se, but because her work was so meaningful for that case. And that case, by the way, was the case that also under the 14th Amendment granted equal rights to women. Okay, so the last person who worked indirectly on Brown versus Board of Education, who was a Rosenwald Fellow, is Ralph Bunche. And as we all know, Ralph Bunche received the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in bringing about an armistice agreement between the Israelis and the Arab states in 1948. While he was at Harvard working on his PhD, he also taught at Howard. And he also worked under Gunnar Myrdal, who was a Swedish economist, and did the research for the Myrdal's book, An American Dilemma. The Negro Problem in Modern Democracy. He contributed more than 3,000 pages to that study and based on his field research in the South. And this study was footnoted in the brief and in the decision by the Supreme Court. So it was indirect, but again, it shows the breadth, the scope, and the quality of the people who worked on this case. Well, let's go to Gordon Parks. Well, pictures are worth 1,000 words. Gordon Parks was a photographer, he became a famous photographer, a fashion photographer, civil rights photographer. He received a Rosenwald Fellowship in 1942, and he was from Kansas, near Topeka, ironically. And in 1947, he photographed, you saw two of the photographs that he did, the doll study research. And it was the article and his photographs appeared in a 1947 issue of Ebony magazine. He didn't play a role in the case, but his photographs really are arresting and meaningful and really lay bare what it's all about. Okay, so the impact of the Rosenwald philanthropy. The Julius Rosenwald and his foundation did not contribute directly to the Brown versus Board of Education case. However, Rosenwald and the Rosenwald Fund did contribute directly to the Rosenwald Fund Fellowship Program, to Howard University, and to the NAACP. You've heard about the 17 Rosenwald Fellows who were involved in the case, and you heard about the Rosenwald Fellows who were either went to Howard University, the law school, or the undergraduate school, and then went on to work, became fellows either at some point and then worked on the case. And you heard about the donations made to Howard University. There's one more donation that the fund made to Howard University. In 1948, the fund was about to close shop because Julius Rosenwald had specified that his fund should not go on forever. He did not believe in that. He believed in giving while you live, and he believed that each generation should address the problems that were most important of that generation. So in 1948, the fund was closing shop, and they gave $7,500. Doesn't seem like very much now, but it's probably about 20 times that amount to the NAACP, 1948, to help with the cases. So that funding helped, and the NAACP, as they were gearing up for Brown versus Board of Education, all 5 cases. And so this is an basically unknown part of Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Fund history. Certainly Stephanie knows all about it. She wrote a paper on it, and in a minute I'm going to ask her if she wants to say something about it. The fund believed that equality of educational opportunity would only fully be realized when segregation was outlawed. And in multiple ways, the fund contributed toward this endpoint by its philosophical conviction, by funding critical research, by direct financial report to the NAACP, and perhaps above all, by identifying promising scholars and enabling them to use their talents for societal change. The Rosenwald Fund contributed greatly, although indirectly, to the elimination of legally enforced school separation. Stephanie, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, thanks, Dorothy. Gosh, I loved your presentation, and I particularly appreciated the way you highlighted the role of Howard University in all this. It's really impossible to overstate how significant Howard was. And it also, this image you've put up there helps see how imaginative Rosenwald's philanthropy was, that it didn't go in just one direction. It did the schools, but it also, well, I love the title of the book that Embry wrote about the history of the Rosenwald Fund. He called it Investment in People. And you can really see how this is where Rosenwald put his money. He put his money in children by investing in the schools, and he put his money in promising adults through the fellowship program. And those are the people who just contributed so much by supporting this case. I also wanted to add one little comment about Pauli Murray. I love the way your presentation highlighted her and highlighted her role. She's someone who's not very well known, but she's a fascinating figure. And I actually, as an Episcopalian, I had the opportunity to speak to my friend Paul Roberts Abernathy, who is a Black Episcopal priest and actually is from St. Louis. And I asked him if he had ever encountered Pauli Murray. And he said, oh, yes, when I was a young priest, she would go to the General Convention, the meeting of the Episcopal Church. And he said, we were always trying to get her to caucus with the Black group, but she wanted to caucus with the women. And so he had a vivid memory of her. And for anyone who is interested in her and wants to know more about her, she wrote both beautiful books. Proud Shoes is her autobiography about growing up in North Carolina, and just a fascinating story. And then Song in a Weary Throat, about her later career. But she's a fascinating figure.
Thank you, Stephanie. We don't have any real time, but I'm going to go through this very quickly. This is the material for another or several more talks, and these are about other notable Rosenwald Fund fellows. And we have a document on our website and that contains brief bios of 97 Rosenwald fellows. So let me go through this really quickly because we're over. I'm sorry about that. There were scientists, scholars, and physicians. W.E.B. Du Bois, if anybody's heard of Percy Julian, hats off to you, but he was the first African-American to become a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And Charles Drew, who did important work in World War II on plasma. Writers, including James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, et cetera, Lillian Smith. Entertainers, Pearl Primus, the dancer, very important Rosenwald Fellow and civil rights activist Marian Anderson. Her fellowship allowed her to go to Germany to study voice. Not to be forgotten, I mentioned that there were 1/3, I didn't say 1/3, but 1/3 of the fellows were white Southerners and others, one of whom was Woody Guthrie. Artist, Jacob Lawrence, who's very famous, and then there's Gordon Parks again. And in closing, I want to say that I find this quote by Julius Rosenwald very meaningful, very powerful. And keep in mind, Julius Rosenwald understood about persecution because his parents were Jews from Germany, came to this country both for more opportunity and to escape the persecution of Jews in Europe. I do not see how America can go forward if part of its people are left behind. That is as true today as it was 100 years ago. And thanks to Laura, we do have a petition, an online petition. We are working this year to get President Biden, if possible, to proclaim the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Monument. A week and a half ago, he proclaimed the Springfield 1908 Race Riot National Monument, again in Springfield, Illinois. And we're hoping he will do this for Rosenwald. It will be the first step toward the eventual National Historical Park, which will be much bigger in multiple states. So for those of you who are interested, we would greatly appreciate it if you could read the petition and sign it. We only ask for first name, last name, email address, state, and city. And we don't use this information for anything other. We don't give it out to any other organization. And the only thing we would use it for is if you want to put on our to receive our newsletter. So this is the top part of the petition. It's on our website. You can reach it by going to www.rosenwaldpark.org/petition, or you could write to me at Dorothy Canter at rosenwaldpark.org. And you can ask, if you write to me, you don't have to do the petition. We'd love you but if you'd like to write to me on any other issue, I'd be happy to hear from you. Finally, this is our website, and there's the website address. And we would love for you to subscribe to our newsletter. We did have an article on Brown versus Board of Education, a special edition of the newsletter on May 17th, 2024, the 70th anniversary of that decision. So again, many thanks to Laura, many thanks to the Merowitz Center and the other co-sponsors of this event, and many thanks to Stephanie for leading the way for me to learn about this important topic.
Thank you so much, Dorothy and Stephanie. This was just truly inspiring program. So much I didn't know. And I'm going to open it up for questions. Maybe, do you want to take down the slides so that we can see each other's faces?
There's a thing here that says leave meeting. I don't want to touch
No,
that.
don't leave the meeting.
How do I,
Just want to close out the slides.
well, it says new share, stop share. I got it. Wait a
There you
minute.
go.
How to get this out of here?
That's perfect.
Oh, okay.
So I'm
right.
just going to ask if anybody has any questions. Want to raise your hands or make a comment. Stephanie, I don't know if you have anything else to add after your comments. Just, I don't know if everybody realizes, Stephanie, we had a program previously on the schools, and Dorothy actually introduced Stephanie. So this is sort of a little bit of a reunion. So Stephanie, thanks for joining us. Anything else you want to add to this?
No, not really. But I guess one thing that Dorothy's presentation kind of, it's something I've been aware of, is there is so much history out there that we all don't know. And I just love the way the current moment is, while some of the teaching of history has become controversial in some places, we're all thinking about it and becoming aware of how much there is we don't know. And you know, so much of it is so inspiring. The history of the Rosenwald schools is a thrilling story of wonderful, the way communities came together in the face of just terrible opposition and prejudice and did something miraculous, seemingly miraculous.
Yeah, I agree. The more you learn, the more amazing the Rosenwald, the impact of Julius Rosenwald's vision. So Susan Blake, you've got a comment or a question?
Yeah, one, was there a standard amount of money that each person got, or did it depend on each individual? And secondly, how did Rosenwald decide that he was going to help the African Americans as opposed to other poor, maybe Jewish immigrants?
Okay, well, first of all, usually it was $1,000 to $1,500 that was awarded, and this again is in the late 20s to the late 40s. That was the usual amount, and as I mentioned before, some of the awardees got fellowships that went on for 2 years and occasionally 3 years. There was only one person who received a fellowship in more than one field, so he received 2 fellowships. I think that was Bontemps, but that's a detail. He was the only one who received a fellowship 1 year in one field and another year in another field. And how did Julius Rosenwald start to give to African Americans? Very good question. First of all, he was already giving to Jewish causes early on. His rabbi was Emil, God, help me.
Hirsch.
Thank you, Stephanie. And he was a very well-known rabbi who believed in social justice, reform rabbi. So he was already giving to Jewish causes, and he continued throughout his life to give to Jewish causes. What got him started, and maybe Stephanie will add a little more at the end, is a friend of his, Paul Sachs. And you know the name Sachs, like Goldman Sachs? Yes, he was of the family. Sent him 2 books. One was Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery, and the other was a book by Robert Baldwin, who had been on the board.
William Baldwin.
William Baldwin, thank you, who was on the board of Tuskegee. He was a railroad executive from New York, I believe Long Island, and Rosenwald was very impressed by him, and I think in some ways he wanted to model himself after him. So the first thing he did before he even met Booker T. Washington is in the end of 1910, people from he had already been giving to the YWCA. People from the YWCA came to ask him if he would donate to a YMCA in Chicago. And African Americans coming to Chicago, if they didn't have family or friends, they didn't have a place to stay, they didn't have a place to eat, they didn't have a place to do almost anything. And so when these people came to meet with him, he stunned them and he said, I will give $25,000. That's a lot of money in 1910. I will give $25,000 to any city in the United States that will match it with $75,000 of independent funds. And so that started that program in late 1910. And when it ended in 1932, there were 24 YMCAs across the country, and 2 YWCAs for African Americans. I believe this is what put him on Booker T. Washington's radar. Washington was a really consummate fundraiser, and that's how I believe they got to meet, and the rest is history. And Washington proposed the school building program to him, and in 1912 he readily agreed. And unfortunately, Washington died in 1915, but Rosenwald continued that program until 1932, greatly expanding it. Stephanie?
Well, I'd just add one thing, which is that Rosenwald was quite explicit about the way, as a Jew, and he once wrote, as a member of a persecuted minority, he identified with African Americans. And he felt, you know, as Dorothy said, his parents had immigrated to this country to get away from what they were experiencing in Germany as Jews. Lack of opportunity, terrible prejudice. And so he had a real sense that this is not just unfair, but it's damaging to all of us to have this situation where we are systematically creating a group of people who are, as he says, despised.
Fran, you have a question? Or a
Yes.
comment?
Oh, well, first off, thank you so much. This is so interesting and informative. And we joined after the last one. My question is, these people who worked on the case, were they funded from some other source, or were they doing it outside of their usual source of income? How were they funded while they spent this 3/6 months working on this case?
I can only give you partial information. So Robert Lee Carter was an employee just like Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP. Mabel Smythe was also employed. I believe the direct people were funded in some way. I read last night, you know, as you're doing your studying before the final exam, that the AFL-CIO gave money to NAACP to help them fund this case. I think it was $75,000. So I can't answer you totally. I would think so. Like I would think, like the sociologists Reed and Fraser, they probably weren't paid, and the peer reviewers, maybe they were paid to come to New York, you know. But the other people working directly on the case, I believe were paid, but I can't tell you how. I know Marshall and Carter, and I believe that John Aubrey Davis and Mabel Smythe, they were paid directly.
Thank you.
So Dorothy, I was just looking at the chat. Gladys said, thank you for a very enlightening seminar. And Barb said there's a great documentary called My Name is Polly Murray. Cindy says, I just signed the petition, easy peasy. And Philip asked if we could just send he said, put the link in the website. So what I was going to do was just follow up the program and just email everybody the information as well from your program. So everybody will have it if they want it. Oh, Michelle, you have a comment or question?
I do. One of the things that I most appreciate in this presentation is the realization of the huge partnership that there was in the achieving of Brown, excuse me, the Brown case. And you know, I know Thurgood Marshall, and I'm a very distant relative of John Hope Franklin.
Really?
I cling to that little bitty string. But I just really appreciate this. I mean, the reviewers, the sociologists, I was aware of the doll study, but I really hadn't connected it with all of this. The historians, the lawyers, and of course the Rosenwald Fellowship money, the funding is just amazing. I can see now the relationship, and I am so grateful. So grateful. Thank you for presenting.
Thank you. I want to say one thing. I learned about Julius Rosenwald in September of 2015. I'm not going to go into the whole story, Stephanie, because you've heard it 1,000 times.
But they might not have.
Well, but I didn't know about him. And there's a documentary called Rosenwald by a Washington documentarian, Aviva Kempner. It's been around since 2015. My husband and I went to see it at a theater. I had never heard of Julius Rosenwald. I'm Jewish. My husband was Jewish. We would have never believed that a Jewish person was the business brains behind making Sears Roebuck what it was. And this has been a very important journey, transformative journey for me doing this. And I've learned so much and about the good, the bad, and the ugly in this country. And doing this project now, it was a lot of work. And I was saying, oh, I can't do my other work. But we got it done. And this was also rewarding. And I'm very happy to share it. And I'm very happy that I got to learn more about this story. The story keeps getting bigger. And thank you for your comments. And yes, John Hope Franklin was an amazing person.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap this up. If anybody has any other questions, now's the time to ask. Otherwise, we're going to say thank you to Dorothy and Stephanie and everybody who participated. There's obviously more to this story, and I'm hoping maybe we can revisit it again sometime in the future and learn even more. And again, thank you everyone for joining us, and we will see you soon.
Shavua Tov and Todah Rabbah.